Welcome everyone to another episode of the Show About Titanic. My name is Edward and I'm your host. Today we're interviewing Stephen Cameron from Belfast, Ireland. On this episode we'll be talking about the origins of Titanic. So let's get this interview started. Hello Stephen, welcome to the Show About Titanic. This is Edward, and so far I'm pretty excited to be meeting you, Stephen. So when I first heard about you, I'm like, Stephen Cameron, that sounds familiar. And I'm like, wait, are you related to the movie maker James Cameron?
No, I'm not. Although my father was called James Cameron, but no, I'm no relative at all, sadly, of James Cameron of Titanic fame.
Yeah. So can you please tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in the Titanic?
Okay. I was in the Northern Ireland Fire Service, and I was a station commander looking after 2 fire stations. And I really had no interest in anything to do with the sea until one day my daughter, who was 11, and at school her teacher was doing a local history project. Sometimes she would do on the Irish famine, sometime on the First World War, but this time she was doing a project on Titanic. And my daughter would come home with material that she'd done in school, and to help her, I bought a book in Belfast. It was actually Robert Ballard's book, Discovering Titanic. And I made the mistake of picking the book up and reading it, and I got totally hooked on the whole thing. I ended up, along with another lady, of co-founding and starting what is now the Belfast Titanic Society. And I met several survivors of Titanic, and I have written 3 books and had 3 books published, 2 of them about Belfast and Titanic.
That's really nice. So which survivors did you have time to meet?
I met Edith Haseman in London. She was, I think, about 13 at the time the Titanic sank. And I also met Mulvena Dean, who was the baby who was on Titanic. She was only a few weeks old, and she was actually put into a canvas bag and hauled up the side of the rescue ship, the Carpathia. And she had come to one of our Titanic Society dinners in Belfast. And after the dinner, she was being shown back to her bedroom and was going up the stairs towards her bedroom whenever she tripped and fell and made a terrible big cut on the front of her leg. So she was taken to the hospital, and the nurse came out in the hospital and said, yes, we can fix that, but there's a wait of about 2 or 3 hours. So the lady who was with her said, do you know who this lady is, to the nurse? And the nurse said, no. And the lady said, well, she was on Titanic. She survived Titanic. 30 seconds later, a doctor, a wheelchair, a porter came out, and she was taken in right away. So sometimes maybe it helps to say that you were on the Titanic.
That's kind of funny. And also, could you tell us a bit about Carpathia?
Yes. When Titanic hit the iceberg, she sent out her first call for help, which was CQD. And she sent that out several times, and then they changed it to SOS. There was a ship close by that they thought was the Californian, that they saw Titanic but thought that they were sailing off in another direction and didn't listen to the messages. The Carpathia ship was about 60 miles away from Titanic. When she got heard the Morse code radio message to say that the Titanic was sinking, her captain, Arthur Rostron, very quickly took control of the situation. He got all the power of the engines turned back into the engines, turned off the heating, turned off all sorts of things, and came as quickly as he possibly could towards where Titanic was. Now, it would take him 4 hours to get to Titanic, and by the time he arrived, all that was left was the people in the lifeboats. Titanic had gone. But he rescued everybody, all those 705 or 708 people. He rescued them all on his ship.
It's kind of odd on how, such a big ship can sink. Could you tell us why was it unsinkable?
Right. Now, Harland and Wolff, who built the ship, never said that the ship was unsinkable. White Star Line I don't think said it was unsinkable, but the British press decided, because of all of these watertight bulkheads that were inside the ship, they said the Titanic was practically unsinkable. What happened was, when Titanic bounced along the side of the iceberg, it put a lot of small holes in the iceberg, okay, for about 300 feet. Now, the problem was that those small holes, well, if you added up the whole area of those small holes, they were no bigger than a door in your living room, all right? But because it was over such a large area, that what happened was that the first compartment filled up with water. Because the bulkheads didn't go right the way up to the deck, water would spill over into the second one. It would fill up. It would spill over into the third one. A bit like, like an ice cube tray.
Yeah.
Water would spill from one to the other, to the other, to the other. And Titanic could have survived with about 3 bulkheads open to the sea, but not with as many as there was 5 bulkheads. And Thomas Andrews, who was the representative of Harland and Wolff, realised very, very quickly that sadly Titanic was going to sink. And he said it would sink in about 2 hours, and it did. It was just over 2 hours, and it sank.
Yeah, it's kind of sad on how a really big ship brought like 2,224 passengers, I think, and less than half of the passengers returned back safely.
That was just the way things happened, and sadly. And I mean, it really, when you look back at it, there was some terrible things that happened. What happened on Titanic was they allowed, first of all, the first-class passengers up onto the deck, and they were allowed to go in. The ladies were allowed to go into the lifeboats. Then the second class were brought up, and they were allowed into the lifeboats. And the third-class people were kept back to the very end. And by the time some of them came up to the deck, all the lifeboats were gone, and some of them had on their very thick cork life jackets, and a lot of them jumped into the water. And the trouble was that whenever they jumped into the water, that the life jacket would have raised up and put their head back and would have broke their neck for them, and they would have been killed right away. And other ones were covered up maybe in just their nightie or their pajamas, and they would have been freezing. And it was just so sad that they were kept back. And that's the way it was done, sadly, in those days. Whereas nowadays, everybody is allowed off at once.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's unfair on how you only let women and children only, but if they had space, you'll let men.
That's right. And that's what they started to do. They started to allow just women and children away first. And sadly, some men did get in. There was one man called Arthur Pewson, who was a yachtsman. And the lifeboat was full of people. It was going down, and somebody shouted back up to the officer on the deck, "There's no sailor on board this. There's no seaman on this lifeboat." And the man turned around, the officer turned around, and he said, "Could anybody help with this?" And this man, Colonel Pewson, came forward and he said, "Well, I'm a yachtsman." And the officer said to him, "Well, if you can go slide down the rope into the lifeboat, you can go ahead." And he went ahead. Another man then went into a lifeboat called Bruce Ismay, who was the chairman of the White Star Line, and he got into one of the very last lifeboats and sat there, and everybody felt that was wrong, that he should have gone down with the Titanic, and he was a coward for getting on board the lifeboat.
I think this is true, but I think they had like a little newspaper comic that had people people are saying, "Look at Ismay, look at Ismay, look at Ismay, look at Ismay."
Yeah, that is very, very true. Bruce Ismay really, the rest of his life, he suffered from getting into the lifeboat. He ended up, he died in Ireland, in County Galway in Ireland, and he really, as you say, there was more and more cartoons in the paper about Bruce Ismay getting into the lifeboat and how wrong he was to do that. Yep, no, you're right.
Yeah, it's kind of like someone just was very important and they just got into the last lifeboat. Like, that'll be pretty odd.
Mm-hmm. Well, the one person that I feel should have been put into a lifeboat was Thomas Andrews.
Yeah.
Thomas Andrews was from a well-known family here in Northern Ireland, or in Ireland, and he was a personal assistant and managing director of Harland and Wolff, and been there from the very first nut and bolt and rivet was put into Titanic. And he should have, along with the logbook, which had all the details of all the sailing and everything that happened up to date, he should have been placed in a lifeboat for the inquiry that was going to happen afterwards. But it was decided no, that that wouldn't happen. And sadly, I think he should have been put into the lifeboat.
Yeah, I agree with you too. It's because it's like he helped people into lifeboats and he gave life jackets out, but he didn't put on his own.
That's right. There's a girl called Mary Sloan, who was a stewardess on board the lifeboat, and he stopped her and told her to put her life jacket on. He was throwing chairs and anything that would float, he was throwing into the water so people could try and hold on to. And he made no attempt to save himself. He actually stood beside in one of the inside rooms where there was a big painting of ships going into New York, and he stood beside that, just looking at that, and that was where he's supposed to have died, looking at this picture. There was another thing that happened, might be of interest to you. A gentleman called Morgan Robertson, about 20 years before Titanic, wrote a book called Futility. And in the book, he wrote a story about a ship called the Titan, which was Titan, and Titanic was Titanic. And he said that this ship, the Titan, was sailing from England to America, and it crashed into an iceberg, and it could have called for help, and a rescue ship called the Majestic came to help them, and the captain of the Majestic was Edward Smith, who was the captain of Titanic. And he wrote this book about 20 years before Titanic, and people never thought anything about it until after Titanic sank. And everybody then got very interested in the story of Morgan Robertson's book called Futility.
Can you tell us a little bit about like how many people did it go in to build the ship?
I mean, when Harland and Wolff started off, they started off with very few men and built it up and built it up and built it up. And in Titanic's time, there was around about 15,000 people employed on building the ship. And we still have some of the books available to show who was working in the shipyard, but they didn't have a register for each ship and who worked on each ship. You could maybe be a painter, and you would finish work on one ship, you'd be then taken on to the next ship, and you'd do a bit of painting then, and go on to the next ship as well. And it would take some considerable time for the ship to actually been built. The keel for Titanic was laid down in 1908, and that was the keel for Olympic, the first ship of the three. 1909, the keel for Titanic was laid down, and they were then built over those next few months, and eventually, April 2nd of April 1912, Titanic would be handed over to the White Star Line, and she would leave Belfast. She was one of three ships. The first ship was the Olympic, then there was the Titanic, and then the last ship in the three series was the Britannic. And some old joker in the shipyard nicknamed them the Beloved, which was Olympic, which William Perry, the chairman, loved. The Damned being Titanic, which sank on her maiden voyage, and the Forgotten being Britannic, which was, as soon as she was completed, the First World War had started, and the government brought her into service in the First World War, and she was lost during the First World War.
Could you tell us a bit more about Edward Harland?
Edward Harland had been born in England, and he had been gone around various shipyards in England. His father was a doctor. He was very, very interested in ships and shipbuilding. And in Belfast, there had been a small shipyard built where Harland and Wolff is today. And Edward Harland was asked over to become the first manager of that shipyard. And he was actually quite a hard man. He didn't allow the workforce to smoke. He didn't like them to talk unless they were having their tea breaks. And he would walk around and make sure everybody was doing their work. He helped to buy the shipyard from a guy called Robert Hickson. And it was a gentleman called Gustav Schwabe, who was a German, who lent Edward Harland money to buy the shipyard off Robert Hickson. And it would cost £4,950 in 1861. Then Gustav Schwabe suggested to Edward Harland that he should take on a partner, and that partner was Schwabe's nephew called Gustav Wolff. So Wolff was taken on first of all as an assistant to Edward Harland, and then eventually as a full partner to Edward Harland, and the shipyard of Harland and Wolff was established in Belfast, and it grew and grew and grew from that. Schwabe, the German, had contacts all round the place, and he knew a gentleman called Thomas Ismay, who had bought over and was running a White Star Line. And he introduced Thomas Ismay to the White Star Line and to Harland and Wolff. And Harland and Wolff would practically build all the ships for the White Star Line from the very first ship that was built, number 72, and they would build all the ships right the way up until just after Titanic. And they wouldn't build ships for anyone else, but they would build exclusively for the White Star Line. And at one stage, Harland and Wolff were the biggest shipyard in the world, and they were selling and building the most number of ships over several years.
Yeah, that's cool on how that worked. Could you explain a bit more about White Star Line and how it functioned? Yes,
the White Star Line had been a shipping company that operated between Great Britain and Australia, and it got into all sorts of trouble. And eventually, Thomas Ismay would make a bid for £1,000 and buy over this flag of what they called the flag of the White Star Line, and he would try and reinvent the whole thing. And it was through his friendship with Gustav Schwabe that he would turn round and go to Harland and Wolff and then have the ships built in Harland and Wolff. And practically all the ships that the White Star Line would have built at Harland and Wolff all ended with the letters IC, Olympic, Titanic, Britannic, Germanic, and so on and so on and so on. And for years and years and years, they would build all the ships for the White Star Line.
And here's my final question.
Okay.
But I still have one more question. This is the final question that I have.
Okay.
So, was there an iceberg that really sank the Titanic?
Yeah. I saw a program after, a few years ago, and it was about the icebergs coming down from Greenland and down the North Atlantic. And it was an American Air Force jet flew over it with a missile and launched a missile at this massive iceberg that was floating down. And it just carried on as if nothing had happened, because an iceberg is like nothing. It's not like an ice cube. This is like hard, solid concrete that if you hit an iceberg, you're going to come off worse than the iceberg is. And yes, I believe that Titanic did strike the iceberg, and that it was the cause of it, and that ice had been flowing so much further south that particular year. And also, the White Star Line gave direction to their crews to go as fast as you possibly could and try and avoid anything that you see. So they were going as fast as they possibly could when eventually they saw the iceberg dead ahead, and they gave the order to turn the helm over and to reverse the engines. And I honestly believe that reversing the engines they had to stop turning the engines and then turn the propellers the other way around to try to get the ship to turn to the left-hand side. And because of reversing the engines, it took longer to get it to turn, and that's why it scraped along the side of the iceberg.
So thank you, Stephen, for being on the show about Titanic.
It has been my pleasure, and I have enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you subscribe to the Show About Titanic wherever you listen to podcasts. Today's episode was produced by Nate, who hosts another podcast that you might like called The Show About Science. See you on the next episode of The Show About Titanic. Bye for now.